Our second presenter today is Thea Phillips from the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and she'll be presenting her work on examining factors associated with ill-being in informal carers of people with haematological cancers, the role of the what and the why of caregiving. Thanks so much, Thea.
Thank you, Kira. So I'm just going to share my slides. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Thea Phillips, and last year I completed my honours in psychology at the University of Sydney, supervised by Dr. Rachel Campbell. And I also wanted to acknowledge the contributions of other researchers that were involved, which includes Rebecca and Kira, who are here today. So my thesis was examining factors related to ill-being in carers of people with blood cancer. Specifically, we focused on the role of carer characteristics, which I will refer to as the what of caregiving, as these are things that relate to the carer themselves, their background, or to their situation. And we were also exploring the role of carer motivation for caregiving, which I'll refer to as the reasons why someone might engage in caregiving. So, as cancer treatments have developed over time, more care for people living with blood cancers like leukemia, lymphoma, or myeloma is being provided at home. This means that their family and friends are playing a very important role in supporting them day to day. Carers support the person with blood cancer through very intense treatments and also through periods of watching and waiting for symptoms to emerge or progress, which can be very anxiety provoking for both the person with blood cancer and their carers. So, despite these challenges, there is little research exploring factors that might be linked to adverse wellbeing outcomes or negative mental health outcomes in blood cancer carers, outcomes like anxiety, depression, carer burden, and fatigue. Now, it's important to be aware of factors that are linked to these outcomes so that we can better identify carers that might need additional supports and also prevent carers from experiencing things like burnout. So, prior research has suggested that there may be certain characteristics that relate to the carer's demographic background or to their caregiving situation that might be linked to poorer or better mental health. So, these characteristics can include age, gender, their living situation, whether they live in rural or urban areas, their relationship to the person they provide care for, or even where the care recipient is at in their treatment timeline. So I've grouped these factors together under the umbrella of the what of caregiving. What is it you can think of it as sort of what is it in the carer's background or in their situation or their immediate circumstances. But these things have been relatively less explored in blood cancer carers, so this requires some further investigation. Apart from these carer characteristics, we also wanted to explore whether motivation for caregiving played a role in blood cancer carers' well-being. So motivation is what energizes and drives behaviors. According to self-determination theory, the reasons why someone engages in a behavior can either positively or negatively impact their well-being. So, in this theory, it's not so much about how much or how little motivation someone has, but rather the quality of the motivation that's important. So, in this theory, motivation can range on a spectrum from more autonomous to more controlled. And I'll break down this diagram a little bit more now. So, when a behavior is driven by more autonomous motivation, the person experiences that behavior as personally meaningful, purposeful, in line with their values, or even enjoyable or satisfying in some way. The quotes on the slide here kind of show how this applies to caregiving. In many areas of research, like in health and sport and in learning, more autonomous motivation is linked to a variety of positive outcomes. On the other hand, more controlled motivations are driven by feeling more pressured to engage in behaviours. So these pressures can come from within the person through their own self-criticism, feelings of guilt or shame, or from others, such as feeling a sense of obligation, expecting praise, or wanting to avoid disapproval from others. And these controlled motivations relate to more negative outcomes. Importantly, according to this theory, the quality of someone's motivation is able to be influenced by the environment around them. So for carers, the environment can include the surrounding healthcare context and their relationships within that. So there are no studies to our knowledge that have applied this theory of motivation to blood cancer carers. The first aim of my research was to see whether certain carer characteristics were linked to poorer mental health in blood cancer carers. And again, it's important to know what factors to sort of look out for so that we can provide more targeted support to carers. So, based on previous research, I expected that there were going to be higher levels of anxiety, depression, carer burden, or fatigue by carers who were female compared to male, relatively older compared to those that were younger, living in rural areas compared to those in urban areas, and those that were juggling more responsibilities like full-time employment or childcare. The second aim was to see whether the quality of caregiving motivation played a role in carers' well-being. So, according to the theory, we would expect that carers reporting more autonomous reasons to provide care would report lower levels of these negative outcomes, and the opposite pattern should be expected for controlled motivations. We also thought that motivation would play such an important role that it would be able to statistically explain differences in these outcomes, even after accounting for those carer characteristics. So we used an international online platform called Prolific, where people can register to participate in online studies. And carers were able to participate in this study from all around the world. So the criteria for inclusion were that carers had to be over the age of 18, adults, spoke English and caring for an adult family or friend with blood cancer. And they were living in one of the countries that I've listed on the slides. So these carers completed a survey which included questions about their demographic background or their caregiving situation. Another measure was their motivation for caregiving. So we provided a questionnaire that included the various reasons for providing care, which I showed on the earlier slide, and carers are asked to rate the degree to which they agree with those reasons. We also measured their levels of anxiety, depression, carer burden, and fatigue. So after collecting this data, we ran some statistical tests, which also included a regression model to examine the associations between the carer characteristics, the motivation for caregiving, and the well-being outcomes. So overall, 281 blood cancer carers completed the survey. The youngest was 18 years old and the oldest was 74. Just over half of the carers were female, and most were living in the US. The most common subtype of the person they were providing care for was leukemia, and most indicated that they were caring for their parent in terms of their relationship to the care recipient. So what did we find? And I'll just summarize the following tables, so don't worry too much about the numbers, but we found that poorer outcomes were more likely to be reported by carers who were younger relative to those that were older, living in rural areas compared to those in urban areas, and carers of those who are currently caring for someone receiving treatment as opposed to someone who had finished their treatment. Next, we found that carers reporting higher levels of autonomous motivation also reported lower levels of anxiety, depression, carer burden, and fatigue. And where there was higher controlled motivation, there was also more likely to be higher levels of these negative outcomes. And as we thought, a statistically significant amount of variance in all of these negative outcomes was able to be attributed to or explained by motivation. So let's unpack these findings. Firstly, for the carer characteristics, we originally expected older age to be linked with worse outcomes. However, we found that younger carer age actually was. This might be because young adulthood is such a transitional life stage where being confronted by the illness of a family member or friend may be particularly unexpected for young people. Carers living in more rural areas were also reporting higher levels on these outcomes, which was what we expected. And rural carers do face unique challenges like receiving less access to support and may also need to travel further and wait longer to receive medical aid. This also might be made more difficult by financial strain or socioeconomic disparities. And lastly, we found that active treatment periods may be a particularly stressful time for carers, especially because this involves accompanying the care recipient to intensive treatments, and also where treatment-related side effects might flare up. None of the other characteristics made any difference in the outcomes, and for the interest of time, I won't elaborate further as to why we didn't find any differences, but we did go into more depth in the thesis. So what about the findings for motivation? As we expected, the more autonomously motivated carers were, the less likely they were to report these adverse negative outcomes. So, this means that experiencing caregiving as personally meaningful, in line with one's values, or being able to recognize its importance may actually be something that can help protect carers from ill-being, almost like a shield or like a resilience factor. On the other hand, more controlled motivations was linked to more negative outcomes. And this suggests that when caregiving is experienced as more pressured, whether that's internally or externally, carers might be more vulnerable to stresses. And the last result about the variance basically means that while both factors do play a role, we found that the motivation for caregiving, the reasons that drive caregiving, the why of caregiving, played an important role in carers' well-being, regardless of what their demographic background or their situation was. So, how can these findings actually help carers? So, firstly, they suggest that younger age, living in rural areas, and active treatment periods may represent potential risk factors. So, this can guide clinicians to know what things to look out for, and help recognize carers that might need additional support and at which points in their caregiving journey. I also want to acknowledge that these characteristics, like age or someone's living situation, are not always things that can necessarily be changed or modified or controlled. So, the fact that motivation played such an important role in carer well-being actually gives us a modifiable target for interventions. So, as I mentioned earlier, the theory says that motivation is something that can be improved or enhanced by the environment around someone. So, how could we improve the quality of carers' motivation? The environment can be thought of for the carer as the wider healthcare system. So, this not only includes the carer's relationships to the person they provide care for, but to other health professionals like GPs, the oncologists, anyone that's supporting in the healthcare system at all, in the caregiving community. So the theory specifies that there are three needs that the environment can either support or neglect. And you can think of these needs as little seeds that when you water them and you take care of them properly in the right conditions, autonomous motivation can grow, and that can promote better well-being. So how can we nourish these things for carers? The first seed, which is the need for autonomy or choice, can be supported by providing carers with more flexibility and choices within their caregiving roles. For example, healthcare professionals can recognize carers as a valuable and active collaborative member of shared decision-making processes. Autonomy can also be supported by connecting with aspects of caregiving that can be viewed as important, valuable, or in line with what is purposeful to that person. And this is called a meaningful rationale for engaging in a behavior. The second need for relatedness, which is feelings of belonging and inclusion, can be supported through warm and empathetic interactions with caregivers. So clinicians can non-judgmentally validate and listen to carers' worries and concerns rather than creating an environment that is felt as quite dismissive or hostile towards carers. Finally, the third need for competence, which is about feeling capable and empowered, can be supported by giving carers the tools and the knowledge that they need to feel more competent in their roles and confident. So this can include informing and educating carers in an accessible and appropriate way to help them feel more guided by the healthcare system and supported by them. So these are the sort of needs that, or the conditions in which autonomous motivation can grow. So hopefully this captures how the theory considers motivation as something that is a changeable thing, even if the carer's circumstances might not be. So overall, the findings of this study can inform practical and clinical intervention, but the study also had some limitations. So typically carers involved in research tend to be the partners or spouses of the person they're providing care for. But in this study, there was a the vast majority of them were caring for their parents. This might have influenced the findings, as perhaps motivation is experienced differently depending on the relationship to the care recipient, which is something that future studies could explore. I also want to acknowledge that all carers were from English-speaking Western countries, and this may raise questions about whether results could generalize to other culturally or linguistically diverse populations. There are a variety of studies that have applied this theory across cultures and do find that the associations still hold true. But because this theory is still being pretty newly explored in caregivers, cross-cultural applications are still a very important direction for future research. So, to summarize, I hope I've been able to demonstrate today how both the what and the why of caregiving play a role in the well-being of blood cancer carers. Importantly, the results of the study suggest that perhaps improving the quality of carers' motivation could be an important part of interventions that aim to support carers' well-being. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thea. What a fantastic honours study. If you have any questions for Thea, please pop them in the Q&A section. I can see there's already one question there for you, Thea. An attendee has asked, were there any outcomes or findings that really surprised you, or were they pretty all much expected?
So, we did find, in terms of the motivation, we did find what we were expecting, which was great because it does show support from the theory. There was one unexpected finding in regards to fatigue and controlled motivation. So we found that that was the only outcome that wasn't predicted by controlled motivation. And we considered that that might have been because the measure of fatigue that we used could have been fatigue may not be as extreme of an indicator of low energy as certain outcomes like exhaustion or burnout. So we thought that maybe the reason why this wasn't found was because of how we measured fatigue. But the really interesting thing was that fatigue was very much predicted by autonomous motivation. So while controlled motivation may not have played a role, the autonomous motivation explained a large amount of variance in fatigue, which is really interesting considering that autonomous motivations or reasons that are more meaningful tend to energize people more. And it might suggest that this might actually have a follow-on effect in terms of their like energy levels and to protect against things like energy depletion. So that was the main
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Thea. I can see there's another question here in the chat from Hannah. Would you expect similar findings across other cancer types or disease groups, particularly with your motivation findings?
That's a really good question. I think if we had all the time in the world, we would have done like different carer populations and, you know, being able to compare. So I think that would be really interesting if future studies could explore differences between not only the subtypes of blood cancer, which we did measure but we didn't test, and also different illness groups. There are previous caregiving research that have applied the theory to carers of people with Alzheimer's disease or dementia or chronic illnesses, and they do find these associations are like similar results to what we found. But cancer carers are less represented in these populations. So that kind of suggests that we do need some future research to sort of see if this is really a universal thing, if it does hold true for other areas, including caregiving.
Yeah, that's a really interesting finding. And I guess somewhat related to that, did you do any sub-analyses across the types of treatments that people were receiving? I know that was a factor that was related to poorer health outcomes. Was that something that you and the team looked at?
So we to measure the treatment status of the person they provided care for, the carers were able to indicate at that time what the care recipient was kind of going through. So whether they were in the middle of treatment, whether they were sort of watching and waiting for symptoms, or if they had finished treatment. But I think that future research could really maybe explore a bit more longitudinally the journey of care, because this only captures one moment in time and only compares carers that are at the same time points, but in very different situations. So I think it would be really valuable to kind of, it would be it's difficult research to be able to, keep the same sort of care as participants throughout, but to see if there are maybe changes over time within the person rather than just comparing where people are at in that one timeline. So that was the results we found, that the carers, that the person they were caring for currently receiving treatment were experiencing higher levels of distress. But it could also be influenced by the fact that most carers in that study said that they were caring for someone with active treatment. So those like imbalance, it's important to have sort of equal numbers of carers representing different parts of the blood cancer treatment trajectory.
Great.
Awesome.
Oh, sorry, Beck, did you have a question?
I did have one really quick question, Thea. Sorry. And I know, yeah, I mean, um, we've obviously worked on this together, but I haven't ever asked you this question before, so it's not like this is a pre-prepared answer,
No.
pre-prepared question. I mean, I think you've spoken really beautifully about the seeds and the environment. I guess I also wondered if we can be using some of the qualities of how people derive value and meaning from their caregiving in things like acceptance and commitment therapy. I mean, I think using that theory seems to indicate that, so I guess to say, is that motivation malleable within a person? And could things like acceptance and commitment therapy or other, counseling or psychotherapeutic techniques, do you think that could be an additional avenue?
Yeah, that's a really important point, I think, because it's very like clinically applied to also, psychological treatments and things like that. So I think definitely autonomous motivation is very closely linked to the principles of ACT, because it's all about bringing attention to what is meaningful to that person and their values and also their identity. But I also think that it could raise some questions, especially regarding carer self-identification and the fact that um, a lot of carers may not identify as carers. So there might be a little bit of a bridging gap before in like reminding them of their values can happen. So there, I think it definitely aligns with that, but there might be people or carers that may be more or less, wanting to engage in that sort of conceptualization of the theory. Hopefully that answers the
Yeah,
question.
that's wonderful. Kira, how are we going for time? I feel like we might need to keep
Yeah.
moving along. There was a one last question, wasn't there, about, and maybe you could quickly answer this one, Thea,
Sure.
in the chat about, sorry, Kira, was it scam participants?
Oh, yeah.
Can
Wondering
you read
if
it out?
there was any trouble with scam participants using an online survey platform.
That's a really good question and a very legitimate concern that we had. I think what we try to do as much as possible was to rigorously, we had a criteria of data quality checks that while we were recruiting participants, we were kind of doing it in batches and we were kind of observing the types of responses that we were getting. If there was any indication that there might have been, someone skipping through questions and or kind of inconsistent responses, then we kind of had this sort of three-tier approach of whether we would include or exclude that particular data point. But also to add Prolific, which is the database site that we've used, there was like a systematic review on, obviously there will always be risks of scam and things like that, but compared to some other platforms, it has shown to be quite high level of data authenticity because Prolific as a system does do a lot of data monitoring checks or just like, parts of verification to ensure that, they are real people that are using the platform. But yeah, so that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a very comprehensive protocol in place and something very important to consider as we have more and more online studies. Thank you so much for such a great presentation, Thea. I'll hand over to Beck now to
Thank
introduce
you.
our next presenter.